Imagine the rugged outlaw, Arthur Morgan, gunslinger of the Wild West, suddenly thrown into the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40K universe. Alien worlds, monstrous chaos creatures, and relentless Imperium forces surround him, where survival isn't just about bullets, it's about adapting to horrors beyond imagination. Will his old-world skills be enough to survive in a galaxy ruled by war, corruption, and technology far beyond his time? Every step he takes could mean life or death, and every decision could alter the fate of those he allies with. Brace yourself for an epic clash of humanity, instinct, and the most brutal universe imaginable, as Arthur fights not just to survive, but to remain human.
Arthur Morgan felt a sting of cold air on his face as he opened his eyes, expecting to see the familiar plains and rolling hills of the Heartlands, the mist of dawn curling lazily around the campsites he'd known all his life. Instead, the world that greeted him was unrecognizable. Massive Gothic spires clawed at the sky, twisted metal scaffolding stretching higher than any mountain back home. The air smelled acrid, thick with smoke, and a strange hum of energy vibrated beneath his boots. His horse, faithful and dependable, was nowhere in sight, and for the first time in years, he felt genuinely alone. Arthur staggered to his feet, muscles aching as though he had slept in the wrong position for a century, and he realized the familiar weight of his revolver at his hip was all he had. He took it out and spun it experimentally, the cold metal a tiny anchor in a world gone mad. His mind raced. Maybe it was a dream, some fever brought on by a long ride through the mountains. Or maybe he had wandered too far from reality and fallen into delirium. But the sensation in his gut, the one that told him something was very wrong, was real. Arthur moved cautiously, each step echoing against the cracked and scarred pavement beneath him. Buildings loomed over him like jagged teeth, their walls etched with symbols he didn't recognize, but somehow felt familiar, as if they belonged to some ancient fear lodged deep in the back of his mind. He clenched his jaw, trying to steady his breathing, and his eyes caught movement out of the corner of his vision. Shadows shifted unnaturally, stretching across the streets like living things. He reached for his revolver again, spinning it with a practiced flick of his wrist, but found himself wishing for something heavier, something that could punch through whatever horrors lurked ahead. A sudden noise, a heavy thud, like metal striking stone, made him whip around. A massive figure appeared from the gloom, clad in armor that gleamed black and gold under the sickly light filtering through the smoke. Arthur instinctively crouched, the gun raised, heart hammering. The figure moved with unnatural precision, its gait steady and unhesitant, and Arthur realized it was alive, somehow both human and more than human. His mind raced. What in God's name was this thing? He remembered tales from Dutch's stories of strange men in the East, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The armored figure didn't speak, didn't move in aggression, but Arthur felt the weight of its gaze as if it could see every secret he had ever tried to bury. For a moment he considered running, but the city— no, this nightmare world was a labyrinth, and retreat offered no comfort, only uncertainty. Arthur began moving cautiously, following the twisting streets and debris-choked alleys. Every turn revealed more of the impossible architecture, towers that bent physics, bridges suspended over nothing, and machinery that whined and hissed as though alive. His instincts, honed from years of surviving in the West, kicked in. He observed, he listened, he calculated. The air smelled of ozone and burning metal, tangy on his tongue, and the faint smell of charred flesh reminded him that death here came swiftly and without warning. He kept his gun ready, spinning it when shadows flickered, imagining hostile creatures that might be just out of sight. Even though he had no idea what this place was, his survival instinct, hard-earned and unyielding, told him to stay alert. Time became a slippery thing. He couldn't tell if hours or minutes passed as he wandered through the ruins. The sky above was a sickly green, streaked with darker clouds that pulsed with lightning-like energy. Arthur paused on a ledge overlooking a plaza where massive war machines rested, dormant but ominous, their sheer size dwarfing even the largest steam engines he had ever seen. My mouth went dry. The world that he knew, where survival meant keeping your wits about you and trusting a good horse, seemed a lifetime away. And yet, deep inside, he felt a spark of familiarity, the grit, the stubbornness, the need to survive at all costs. A sudden crack echoed through the air, and Arthur ducked instinctively. From the shadows emerged a figure, smaller than the armored giant he had seen earlier, but still unnatural, moving with fluid grace and carrying weapons that hissed and crackled with energy. Arthur froze, realizing that he might have just stumbled into a battlefield, or worse, a world perpetually at war. He remembered the lessons Dutch had drilled into him. Read people, anticipate danger, and always, always keep your head. He assessed the figure, noted its stance, the way it moved, and realized he was outmatched if it came to a fight. His hand hovered over the trigger, heart racing, as his mind spun through possibilities. Fight, run, hide, negotiate. Arthur didn't have time to decide. The hum in the air grew louder, almost oppressive, vibrating through his bones. Sparks of energy arced across the plaza, and he felt the hair on his arms stand on end. Somewhere in the distance, a massive explosion shook the ground, sending clouds of debris into the green sky. Arthur ducked behind a chunk of twisted metal, trying to make sense of it all. He felt a pang of longing for the West, the smell of pine, the warmth of campfires and the quiet moments between chaos. But they were gone now, replaced by a universe that demanded more than he had ever given. As he took a deep breath, steadying himself, Arthur realized something vital. Despite the alien landscape, the overwhelming threats, and the unknown dangers lurking at every turn, he still had the same tools he had always relied on: his mind, his instincts, and his stubborn determination not to go down without a fight. Whatever this world was, he would need every bit of cunning and courage he had to survive it. And for the first time since waking in this impossible place, Arthur Morgan smiled grimly to himself, spinning his revolver in hand, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead.
Arthur Morgan had barely caught his breath from the bizarre landscape when he heard it, a deep, resonant thrum, like the heartbeat of some colossal beast, vibrating through the metal streets and concrete spires. He froze, hand instinctively hovering over his revolver, eyes scanning for movement, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered in the West. No horse hooves, no human footsteps, not even the low growl of a wild animal. It was deliberate, controlled, and it filled the space around him with an almost physical weight, pressing into his chest and making his teeth chatter. He ducked behind a jagged chunk of debris, heart hammering, trying to make sense of what he was about to face. A shadow moved across the plaza ahead, enormous and calculated. Arthur's first thought was that he was seeing things, that maybe his mind was still clinging to fragments of the Old West in some fevered hallucination. But then the figure stepped into the light, and all doubt vanished. It was tall, at least twice the height of any man Arthur had ever met, and encased in gleaming, intricate armor that looked as if it had been forged by some god of war. The plating was thick, angular, and covered in symbols he couldn't read but instinctively understood. They marked strength, purpose, and deadly efficiency. The figure's movements were deliberate yet fluid, each step a quiet demonstration of authority, and despite the armor, he felt something disturbingly alive in the way it moved. Arthur swallowed hard, trying to calm his racing heart. He'd dealt with dangerous men before, men who could shoot faster than he could blink. But this was something different. The figure's helmet bore a single, unblinking visor, a window that seemed to pierce right through him. Arthur felt exposed, naked in a way that terrified and fascinated him. He had learned over the years that size didn't always mean power, but this figure radiated a confidence and capability that left him in no doubt. He instinctively took a step back, dragging his boots across loose rubble, but the armored giant didn't move with him. It simply observed, still, silent, a sentinel of some unfathomable order. Arthur's mind raced, recalling every story Dutch had ever told him about strange men in distant lands, about battles that defied understanding. None of them compared to this. He realized quickly that he couldn't rely on the same tactics he had in the West. There was no flanking a creature like this, no bluffing or intimidation. Yet his survival instinct screamed that he had to try something. He straightened up, his hand resting firmly on his revolver, spinning it in a nervous, habitual gesture. Well now, ain't exactly like riding into Valentine, is it? The figure shifted slightly, and the hum of its armor amplified, almost as if it were breathing. He noted the way it carried itself, assured,
measured, every movement efficient and controlled. He realized he couldn't just stand there and hope it didn't attack. In the West, survival often meant confrontation, but here the rules were different. This being wasn't human, at least not in the way he understood humans. It radiated authority and lethal intent, and he knew that any sudden move could mean instant death. Arthur's eyes flicked to the weapon holstered at the giant's side, a gun unlike any he had ever seen. It was massive, heavy, and emitted a low, almost electric hum. He could almost feel its energy crackling in the air, a subtle warning of the destructive force it could unleash. His fingers tightened around his revolver's grip, though he knew in his heart it was barely a match. The comparison stung, but it also fueled a familiar fire in him, the resolve that had kept him alive through gunfights, storms, and betrayals. He had faced impossible odds before, and this was beyond anything he could imagine. But Arthur Morgan was nothing if not stubborn. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped from behind the rubble. His boots clanged against the broken pavement, a small declaration of presence. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if to acknowledge him, though he couldn't tell if it was curiosity, recognition, or a warning. He tried to gauge its intentions, but nothing about this being made sense. No words were exchanged, no gestures, just a silent standoff between two very different worlds. He realized that one false move could end him in an instant, yet inaction wasn't an option either. Arthur's thoughts raced back to the code he lived by: loyalty, honor, and survival. In a moment like this, those principles were his anchor. He knew he had to act carefully, to show neither fear nor aggression more than necessary. Slowly, he raised his hand slightly, a subtle gesture, signaling he meant no immediate harm. The armored figure paused, its hulking presence unmoving, and then, almost imperceptibly, it nodded. Arthur exhaled, a small rush of relief mingled with tension. But he knew this encounter was only the beginning. In this strange, grimdark world, allies and enemies often looked the same, and understanding the difference could mean life or death. Arthur studied the figure, committing every detail to memory: the angular armor, the hum of power, the calculated grace of movement. Every part of him screamed caution, but a part of him, the part that had survived countless betrayals and impossible escapes, told him that this being could also be a guide, a protector, or even a reluctant ally. Arthur adjusted the grip on his revolver, the familiar weight grounding him as he stepped cautiously forward, ready to face whatever challenge this imposing figure represented. A faint vibration ran through the ground, and Arthur's ears caught a metallic whisper, like gears turning beneath the earth, machinery that was alive and aware. He realized that in this universe, the rules he had known were irrelevant. Here, the powerful did not merely fight, they dominated, they enforced, and survival meant understanding forces far beyond simple human cunning. And yet, even in the shadow of such overwhelming power, Arthur felt that stubborn spark, the stubborn, unyielding will to survive, to carve out his place, and to face the unknown with grit, gun, and resolve.
Arthur Morgan had survived the impossible before, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the rigid, suffocating order of the Imperium. Every step he took through the ruined city felt like walking through a maze built to test not strength, but obedience. The streets were choked with smoke and debris, punctuated by massive statues of stern, unyielding figures whose eyes seemed to follow him wherever he went. Each building bore inscriptions in a language he could not read, and yet there was an unmistakable tone of authority and finality in every symbol. He realized quickly that rules here were not suggestions, they were laws, enforced by unseen hands that brooked no disobedience. Arthur moved cautiously, senses sharpened, trying to make sense of this alien order. His instincts from the West, reading people, judging intentions, gauging danger, were still useful but insufficient. Here, even the act of standing still could draw suspicion.
He saw figures moving in long, flowing robes, their heads adorned with strange devices that hummed with energy. They passed him without acknowledgement, yet their presence radiated power, a subtle threat that seemed to linger in the air like ozone after a storm. Arthur could feel it pressing against him, testing his resolve. He tightened his grip on his revolver, the familiar weight grounding him as he navigated this strange world where the very act of existing seemed to demand justification. He quickly learned that trust was a rare currency. Every interaction carried weight. Every glance could be interpreted as either compliance or defiance. Arthur had been part of gangs, of groups bound loosely by loyalty and fear, but the Imperium's structure was unlike anything he had ever seen. There were hierarchies within hierarchies, and each individual carried an authority that could crush him in an instant. A misstep, even unintentional, could bring the wrath of a local enforcer, or worse. He witnessed a man being dragged from a plaza by figures in black armor, his protests ignored, his fate sealed in silence. Arthur shivered, realizing that morality here was often irrelevant. Survival depended on understanding and navigating power, not right or wrong. As he moved deeper into the city, the sounds of industry and war became unavoidable. Massive factories churned endlessly, forging weapons of unimaginable size and complexity. The air was thick with soot, the constant vibration beneath his feet reminding him that life here was built around machinery and power, not nature or human comfort. He marveled and recoiled simultaneously, understanding that this was a society of extremes where devotion to duty replaced the small freedoms he had cherished in the West. The Imperium demanded submission, but it also offered protection in ways he did not fully grasp. Arthur had to reconcile his instinct for freedom with the necessity of surviving in a system that brooked no deviation. He observed the enforcers, halting armored warriors, moving with a precision and authority that was terrifying. Each step they took seemed deliberate, a silent warning that nothing escaped their notice. Arthur realized that here, speed and cunning alone were not enough. Understanding protocol, anticipating judgment, and showing measured compliance were just as crucial as holding a weapon. His old ways, bluffing, intimidation, relying on gunplay, were tools of the past. He needed patience, observation, and a careful read of every gesture and glance. He adjusted his behavior accordingly, lowering his shoulders, keeping his eyes steady yet not submissive, trying to convey competence without arrogance. Arthur's journey through the city became a lesson in survival under strict authority. He saw that loyalty was demanded, not earned, and that every action was scrutinized. A slip of the tongue, a hesitation, a failure to respond correctly could bring immediate consequences. Yet paradoxically, he also noticed that competence and courage were recognized. He watched a small squad of soldiers execute a complex maneuver under the watchful gaze of their superiors, and for a brief moment, he felt a strange admiration. There was honor in this discipline, even if it was brutal and unforgiving, and he understood that navigating it would require both respect and cunning. Despite the oppressive order, Arthur found glimpses of human connection. A tech priest offered a brief nod of acknowledgement, a subtle recognition of his presence, and a young recruit gave him a fleeting glance, curious but wary. Arthur knew instinctively that these small gestures were rare currency in this universe, moments of humanity amidst the overwhelming machinery and control. He smiled faintly to himself, understanding that even in a world dominated by law and war, subtle bonds could exist, and noticing them could be the difference between survival and destruction. As he progressed, Arthur began to understand the scope of the Imperium's reach. The city was only one node in a vast network of worlds, each governed by its own strict hierarchy, each enforcing obedience in 1,000 ways. He realized that the survival skills that had served him in the West, sharp reflexes, quick thinking, courage under fire, were still essential, but insufficient. He would need to adapt to a system where judgment and political awareness were as vital as gun skill and endurance. Arthur's mind drifted back to Dutch and the gang, the familiar rules of loyalty and survival in a world of shifting alliances. He realized that here, those rules were amplified 100-fold.
Every decision had consequences, every action observed, every hesitation recorded. And yet, beneath the weight of the Imperium's authority, he felt a familiar spark. The stubborn, unyielding determination to survive, to adapt, and to find a way forward, even in a world that seemed designed to crush him. He adjusted his hat, tightened his coat against the acrid wind, and took a careful step forward, knowing that in this city of law, war, and absolute power, understanding the rules was just the first step towards mastering them.
Arthur Morgan had been wandering through the Imperium's ruined streets for what felt like days, though he had lost all sense of time in this alien world. Each corner revealed new horrors, burning debris, the echoing footsteps of armored enforcers, the mechanical hum of distant factories, and with each step he felt the oppressive weight of the Imperium's unyielding order pressing down on him. His mind, always sharp and calculating, was beginning to fray under the constant vigilance required to survive. Then, just as he was beginning to feel the isolation threatening to swallow him, he heard it, a soft, clinking sound, almost like someone moving carefully through metal debris. Arthur froze, spinning his revolver instinctively, heart hammering, searching for the source. The shadows shifted, and a figure emerged, small, hunched, but unmistakably alive. The figure wore robes adorned with intricate devices and wires, some humming faintly with light. A partially mechanical arm extended from beneath the robes, ending in fingers that glinted under the flickering light. Arthur's first instinct was caution. He had learned long ago in the West that survival often depended on judging strangers quickly. But something in the figure's movements, careful and deliberate rather than threatening, made him hesitate. The stranger raised one hand slightly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. Arthur lowered his revolver marginally, though his grip remained firm. You ain't one of them," the figure said, in a strange, clipped voice, a combination of mechanical resonance and human timbre. Your presence is unusual, but not hostile." Arthur exhaled slowly, feeling a small spark of relief. He had survived gunfights, betrayals, and the law, but the uncertainty of this world weighed heavier than any outlaw chase. Arthur studied the stranger. There was something almost human about them, despite the mechanical augmentations and strange robes. He noticed the subtle movements, the way the fingers twitched, the slight tilt of the head that betrayed intelligence, curiosity, and caution. He realized quickly that this was not an enemy to be shot, nor a mindless creature to be feared. This was someone navigating the same brutal reality he was, someone forced to adapt in a universe of unyielding authority and war. For the first time since arriving, Arthur felt a flicker of hope that he might find an ally in this unforgiving world. The figure introduced themselves in a string of words that Arthur struggled to follow at first, but the meaning was clear. They were a tech priest, a practitioner of the strange fusion of machine and spirit that he had glimpsed in the city. They had knowledge of this world, its dangers, and the unspoken rules. You don't belong here," the tech priest said, "but perhaps you can learn." Arthur frowned, feeling a mix of skepticism and cautious optimism. "You learn what exactly?" he asked. He had learned over years on the frontier that survival required learning fast, adapting faster, and trusting no one entirely. Yet something about the tech priest suggested that they might be different, a guide rather than a threat. The tech priest moved closer, their mechanical fingers tracing faint patterns in the air,
illuminating faint symbols only visible to those attuned to the machine spirit. Arthur's eyes followed the patterns, fascinated despite himself. The being's knowledge seemed immense, almost otherworldly, and he realized that if he were to survive, he needed guidance. The tech priest gestured for him to follow, and Arthur hesitated, weighing the risks. He had been burned by trusting the wrong people before, but instinct told him that the choice was necessary. With a grunt, he fell in step behind the tech priest, careful to keep his revolver ready, yet allowing a fragile sense of trust to take root. As they moved through the ruins, Arthur began asking questions, slow and cautious. What is this place? Who are they? The tech priest answered in measured tones, speaking of the Imperium, the enforcers, the hierarchy, and the constant war that consumed worlds. Arthur listened intently, storing every piece of information like precious ammunition for survival. He realized that knowledge here was as lethal as any gun, and this companion was offering him the tools to navigate it. Occasionally, the tech priest would pause, pointing out hidden dangers, weak structures, unstable debris, and patrol routes, and Arthur began to understand the subtle cues that marked survival in this city. Despite the alien surroundings, Arthur found comfort in the shared presence. The tech priest was quiet but attentive, moving with precision, yet offering enough pauses for conversation to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Arthur shared fragments of his own story, the life he had left behind in the West, the gang, the struggles, and the code he lived by. The tech priest listened, responding occasionally with mechanical clicks and faint whistles of understanding. Arthur felt a connection forming, not a friendship in the old sense, but a recognition of kindred survival instincts in a world that punished weakness. Hours, or maybe days, passed as they navigated the city together. Arthur began to rely on the tech priest's guidance, learning to anticipate patrols, interpret signs of danger, and understand the subtle language of power in the Imperium. In turn, he shared his own skills, quick thinking, improvisation, and the keen observation that had kept him alive in the West. The exchange was mutual, a melding of human intuition and mechanical precision, and Arthur realized that survival here would not be a solitary endeavor. As they paused on the edge of a shattered plaza, Arthur looked at his unlikely companion, feeling a rare sense of reassurance. In this brutal, alien world, where rules were absolute and death often came without warning, he had found someone who could help him adapt. The tech priest's presence was a reminder that even in the darkest, most unyielding universes, alliances, however fragile or unexpected, could form, offering the faintest hope of navigating the impossible and carving a path forward.
Arthur Morgan had faced a lot in his life. Gunfights on dusty streets, ambushes in dark canyons, storms that threatened to wash him away. But nothing had prepared him for the sheer alienness of the technologies surrounding him now. Every step through the Imperium's sprawling, ruined cities revealed machinery that defied logic, weapons that hummed with energy instead of gunpowder, and devices that seemed alive, as if they contained their own will. His eyes flicked nervously from one strange contraption to another, revolver still in hand, a familiar anchor in a world that seemed determined to strip him of everything he knew. The hum of lasguns in the distance, the faint crackle of energy barriers, and the deep, resonant thrum of massive engines vibrating through the ground made his skin prickle. The tech priest he had allied with moved ahead confidently, fingers tracing symbols on panels and levers, their mechanical limbs moving with a precision that Arthur envied.
You must understand the tools before you can survive, the tech priest said, their voice mechanical but calm. Arthur nodded slowly, swallowing hard, trying to make sense of it all. His hands flexed around his revolver, but curiosity gnawed at him. He had always been quick to learn, quick to adapt in the West, but this was a new frontier in every sense of the word. Here, survival wasn't just about reflexes or courage. It was about understanding the tools that wielded unimaginable power. Arthur's first encounter with the weapons was humbling. A lasgun, lighter than he expected, hummed in his hands, its energy crackling faintly. The way it pulsed, almost alive, made him hesitate. He had fired rifles and revolvers all his life, but this was different. The recoil was nothing like he was used to, yet the power behind it promised destruction that would have taken half a dozen of his old bullets. He squeezed the trigger experimentally, and a beam of searing light cut across the plaza, leaving a small crater in its path. Arthur jumped back, heart racing, realizing that a single misfire here could mean death, not just his own, but anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "God almighty! Ain't like shooting a tin can no more." The tech priest observed silently, occasionally offering a nod or adjusting a lever to stabilize the weapon. Arthur followed their guidance, learning to account for the weapon's energy, its heat, its pulse. He marveled at how precise and destructive it could be in the hands of someone who knew what they were doing. "It's alive," he whispered to himself, a mixture of awe and fear in his voice. The tech priest didn't disagree. Here, machines had a personality, a rhythm, a way of responding to those who treated them with respect or contempt. Arthur understood that disrespecting these tools could be fatal, and he made a mental note to treat them as carefully as he treated a wild horse back home. Listen, feel, anticipate. Beyond lasguns, the Imperium offered weapons that challenged even his imagination. Bolters, massive firearms with a thunderous kick, seemed almost ridiculous until he felt the raw power in their frame. One test shot sent debris flying, the ground quaking beneath him, and Arthur staggered back instinctively, marveling at the force concentrated in such a small package. He realized quickly that these were not just weapons, they were instruments of war, designed for precision, for terror, and for annihilation. And yet handling them required more than brute force. Timing, positioning, and understanding each weapon's unique behavior became a lesson in patience and observation, one he had never needed to learn in the West. Even the simplest tech fascinated him. He examined grenades that levitated slightly before detonation, armor that responded to movement and environmental conditions, and energy shields that flared with light when struck. Arthur's fingers itched to touch everything, to test each tool, but instinct warned him that mistakes could be fatal. He approached each weapon cautiously, experimenting, learning, and adapting. In some ways, it reminded him of teaching a young recruit or taming a stubborn horse back home. Patience, observation, and respect were key. Despite the danger, Arthur couldn't help but feel exhilarated. This was a world of extremes, but it rewarded quick learners and bold thinkers. He began to imagine scenarios, practicing maneuvers, combining his old skills with the new tools at hand. Cover, timing, and strategy, all the principles he had relied on back home still applied, but the scale and lethality had increased exponentially. Every corner could hide death, every weapon could shift the balance of power, and every misstep could be fatal. And yet he thrived on the challenge, feeling alive in a way that few experiences in the West could match. The tech priest remained a patient guide, occasionally offering advice or cautioning against reckless experimentation. Arthur listened carefully, absorbing knowledge as quickly as he could. He realized that survival here meant more than reflexes. It required understanding the rhythm of technology, the language of machines, and the nuances of power. Each weapon, each device, each unfamiliar system had a personality, and learning to anticipate and respect that personality became a mental game, testing his patience and adaptability in ways he had never imagined. By the time the sun, or whatever passed for sunlight in this greenish, polluted sky, cast long shadows across the jagged plaza, Arthur had handled more weapons than he could count. Las guns, bolters, plasma cutters, and mechanical pistols now felt slightly less alien, though still terrifying in their power. He had learned to respect each one, to anticipate its quirks and limitations, and to trust his instincts when wielding them. Every successful test, every controlled discharge bolstered his confidence and reinforced a truth he had known all his life. Survival demanded adaptation, courage, and a relentless curiosity. As Arthur stepped back, revolver holstered but senses heightened, he realized that in this world of unimaginable technology, he had begun to find his footing. The weapons, once alien and threatening, were becoming extensions of his will. The learning curve was steep, the consequences severe, but for the first time since arriving in this grim, unyielding universe, he felt a flicker of control.
Arthur Morgan had faced his fair share of danger in the West, ambushes, storms, and desperate gunfights, but nothing in his life could have prepared him for the abominations that emerged from the shadows of the Imperium's ruined city. He had been walking cautiously through a narrow corridor of collapsed buildings, the hum of distant machinery vibrating beneath his boots when he first heard it, a guttural, unnatural sound, like the grinding of bone against steel. His hand immediately went to his revolver, but instinct told him that bullets alone would not solve this. His stomach churned, a deep unease settling into his gut, and he realized that survival here would demand more than experience. It would demand courage he had never tested. The first figure stepped into the dim, greenish light, and Arthur's breath caught. It was humanoid in shape, but distorted, twisted by some malevolent force he could barely comprehend. Flesh and armor melded unnaturally, sinews and cables intertwined in a grotesque parody of life. Its eyes glowed with a sickly red light, and it moved with a predatory grace that made every muscle in Arthur's body tense. He recognized the danger immediately. This was not a man, not a soldier, not anything he could negotiate with. This was chaos incarnate, a creature born of corruption and malice, and it had no regard for mercy or reason. Arthur felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the same one that had saved him countless times in the West, but it was accompanied by an unfamiliar terror. He had killed men and animals alike, but never had he faced something that defied natural law, something whose very existence challenged his understanding of reality. His hand immediately went to his revolver, but instinct told him that bullets alone would not solve this. His stomach churned, a deep unease settling into his gut, and he realized that survival here would demand more than experience. It would demand courage he had never tested. The creature advanced, and Arthur instinctively ducked behind a ruined wall, heart hammering, scanning for weaknesses. Its movements were deliberate yet chaotic, a contradiction that made predicting its attacks nearly impossible. Sparks flew as it scraped against metal, and the air reeked of ozone, blood, and something acrid he couldn't name. Arthur's pulse raced as he realized that he could neither outrun it nor engage it as he would a man. He needed a plan, an angle, something to exploit, and fast. Every second wasted increased the risk of death. He remembered the lessons from Dutch: always stay calm, always assess your environment, always think 2 steps ahead. Arthur's eyes roamed the corridor, noting the debris, the jagged metal, the crumbling walls. Perhaps he could use the environment to his advantage, force the creature into a confined space,
or create a barrier between them. His mind raced, calculating angles, escape routes, and opportunities for attack. But even as he strategized, a deep primal fear gnawed at him. This was no ordinary fight. It was a battle of survival against something that didn't follow the rules he understood. The creature snarled, a sound that resonated through Arthur's chest, and for the first time, he felt the weight of mortality in a way that was visceral, undeniable. He could die here, alone, in a world that was as alien as it was merciless. The fear was sharp, electric, but it also sharpened his focus. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and reminded himself that he had survived impossible odds before. Every skill he had ever learned, every instinct honed in the lawless plains of the West, now had a purpose in this grim, unrelenting universe. As the creature lunged, Arthur rolled to the side, firing his revolver. The bullets ricocheted off its armor-like flesh with a sickening clang, barely slowing it down. He cursed, realizing that conventional weapons were insufficient against chaos. He needed to improvise, to think creatively, to turn his environment into a weapon. He kicked a rusted piece of metal, sending it flying toward the creature's legs, buying himself precious seconds. The thing howled in response, the sound a mixture of pain, rage, and something unearthly, and Arthur felt a shiver run down his spine. Every instinct screamed to run, but he knew that running could be just as deadly. Chaos didn't tire, didn't hesitate, and could track him across impossible terrain. Arthur's mind raced, recalling every trick, every feint, every desperate gamble that had kept him alive in the West. He adapted on the fly, using shadows, debris, and his understanding of human and now non-human movement to stay one step ahead. Sweat beaded on his brow, his breathing ragged, but he refused to give in to panic. Fear was a tool, he reminded himself, and he would wield it as carefully as he wielded his gun. The creature shifted, moving in ways that seemed to defy anatomy, and Arthur's stomach lurched. He had to recalibrate constantly, to anticipate attacks that made no sense, to trust instincts that had never been tested against such monstrosities. Yet even as terror gripped him, he felt the familiar thrill of survival, the rush of adrenaline, the clarity of focus, the raw satisfaction of outthinking and outmaneuvering a deadly foe. He realized that in this war-torn universe, courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was moving forward despite it, confronting horrors that would shatter lesser men. Arthur ducked behind another barricade, heart pounding, eyes scanning for the next threat. The creature paused, sniffing the air, its glowing eyes locking on him. He realized something vital. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a test of adaptability, of nerve, and of instinct. The West had taught him to endure, to fight, to survive, but chaos demanded more. It demanded that he confront the unimaginable, respond to the impossible, and remain human when everything around him screamed otherwise.
Arthur Morgan had learned early in life that survival alone was never enough. A man needed a code, some principle to anchor him when the world threatened to pull him under. The West had taught him that loyalty, honor, and instinct were just as important as speed and aim. But here, in the grim, oppressive universe of the Imperium, those rules were tested in ways he had never imagined. Every corner he turned, every alley he passed, carried potential danger, not just from the chaos and corruption he had seen, but from men and machines alike. The code he had lived by for decades felt fragile here, and yet he clung to it as a lifeline. Arthur walked carefully through a ruined district, the hum of distant machinery echoing off jagged walls. Smoke and dust swirled in the air, carrying the acrid scent of burning metal and flesh. In the distance, he saw a small group of humans struggling under the oppressive gaze of armored enforcers. Arthur recognized the fear in their movements, the same fear he had seen in townspeople back in Valentine, when lawmen came calling, or when rival gangs rode in for blood. The men were cornered, hopelessly outmatched, and Arthur's hand itched for his revolver. He knew intervening could mean drawing unwanted attention, yet his sense of honor burned hotter than caution. Without hesitation, he slipped through the shadows, careful to remain unseen until the moment was right. He had faced impossible odds before, and while the Imperium's soldiers were unlike any enemies he had ever encountered, Arthur trusted the instinct that had kept him alive for years. He aimed his revolver, not at the enforcers themselves, but at a weak point in their formation, a calculated disruption that could buy the humans enough time to escape. Each shot rang out sharply, echoing across the crumbling buildings, and the men he intended to help scattered, confusion and relief flashing across their faces. Arthur stayed hidden, observing the aftermath, knowing that even small acts of courage here carried enormous risk. After the confrontation, Arthur moved closer to one of the survivors, a young man clutching a scavenged blast gun like it was a lifeline. The boy's eyes were wide with shock, and Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder, firm but reassuring. "You did good," he muttered, voice low but steady. "Keep your head down, move smart, and don't get caught staring. Ain't no shame in surviving." The boy nodded, barely understanding the words, but grasping the sentiment. Arthur realized that even in a universe as brutal as this one, human connection mattered. Acts of honor, courage, and guidance were not just moral choices, they were lifelines, small sparks of humanity in a galaxy defined by war and death. As he continued his journey, Arthur found himself in a fortified sector controlled by the Imperium. Soldiers and enforcers moved with precision, their expressions stern, their authority absolute. Here, every action mattered, and missteps could have deadly consequences. Arthur observed quietly, learning the subtle cues, the tilt of a head, the way a hand rested near a weapon, the rhythm of patrols. He began to apply his own code in small ways, helping those in need without drawing attention, offering guidance when he could, and maintaining respect for authority while never compromising his principles. It was a delicate balance, but one he felt compelled to maintain. One day he stumbled upon a scene that tested him more than anything he had faced since arriving in this universe. A small group of civilians had been cornered by a corrupted enforcer, a man whose armor was twisted and blackened, his eyes glowing with unnatural red light. The enforcer demanded compliance, and Arthur could see the fear and desperation in the civilians' faces. Every instinct screamed for caution. One wrong move could mean death. Yet his sense of honor refused to let him stand idle. He calculated his approach, using the environment to his advantage, and moved with precision, taking down the corrupted figure with a combination of stealth, distraction, and firepower. The civilians escaped, and Arthur felt a deep, hollow satisfaction, not because of the violence, but because he had upheld his principles under pressure. Throughout these encounters, Arthur's reputation began to grow quietly. Whispers of the man with the strange accent, the one who intervened when others would not, began to circulate among those he helped. People began to seek him out, not only for protection but for guidance, because he had demonstrated that morality and courage could exist, even in a universe defined by war and death. Arthur understood the irony. The Imperium demanded obedience and fear, yet he found that honor and trust could carve a place even amidst tyranny. Despite the constant danger, Arthur found moments of reflection. At night, when the greenish light of the sky bathed the city in a grim glow, he would sit in quiet corners, revolver resting beside him, and think about Dutch, the gang, and the West he had left behind. His code was what kept him grounded, a tether to a world of loyalty and human decency. Even here, amidst alien technology, chaos, and oppressive authority, he clung to those principles, letting them guide his decisions, protect those who could not protect themselves, and maintain a sense of identity when everything else was alien and hostile. Through every encounter, every act of courage, every moment of quiet reflection, Arthur realized that his code of honor was not just a relic of the past. It was a weapon in itself. It allowed him to navigate a universe designed to crush individuality, to survive encounters with creatures and forces beyond comprehension, and to form bonds that might one day mean the difference between life and death. In the grim, unyielding expanse of the Imperium, Arthur Morgan's stubborn adherence to his principles became a quiet rebellion, a reminder that even in the darkest places, humanity could endure, and a man could still choose to stand for something greater than mere survival.
Arthur Morgan had always been accustomed to hardship, riding through the cold winds of the heartlands, dodging rival gangs, and surviving harsh winters, but the environments of the Imperium pushed survival to levels he had never imagined. Each step through the ruined cities, across shattered bridges and scorched plazas, carried an invisible weight. The air was thick with ash and ozone, carrying a stench of burned metal and the faint, lingering scent of death. Every surface seemed unstable, every shadow potentially hiding threats beyond comprehension. Even his boots, tough and worn from years of traversing rugged terrain, felt inadequate against the warped, jagged streets that seemed to shift under his weight. Arthur moved cautiously, every muscle taut, revolver in hand, eyes scanning constantly. The familiar rhythm of his Old West instincts, reading the land, sensing danger, anticipating movements, remained, but it now had to contend with a world where nothing obeyed the laws of nature. He leapt over fissures that split the ground like gaping maws, ducked under twisted metal frameworks, and navigated piles of debris that could collapse at any moment. The sensation was unnerving, yet exhilarating. It reminded him of nights spent sneaking through enemy camps or the tense moments before a gunfight, except now the stakes were magnified 1,000-fold. As he moved deeper into the city, he encountered environmental hazards unlike any he had seen. Pools of strange glowing liquid bubbled and hissed, corroding the metal and stone they touched. Sparks from damaged machinery arced through the air, threatening to ignite the surrounding rubble. Arthur's instincts told him to keep low, move carefully, and avoid unnecessary risks. He felt the adrenaline surge through him, heightening every sense, sharpening every reflex. Survival here demanded more than skill with a weapon. It demanded constant vigilance, patience, and adaptability. The skies above were a sickly green, streaked with storm clouds that pulsed with energy, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated massive, jagged structures in the distance. Arthur paused at the edge of a collapsed overpass, staring down at the chasm below, the rumble of unseen engines vibrating through the air. He knew that the fall would be fatal, yet he also recognized the danger of hesitation. In this world, delay could be as deadly as action. He took a careful breath, assessed the distance, and leapt, landing with a heavy thud and a grunt, rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. Survival demanded forward momentum, no matter how battered he became. Navigating the hostile environment also required clever use of makeshift cover and observation. Crumbling walls, jagged debris, and overturned vehicles became shields and vantage points, allowing him to survey the terrain for threats. Every movement carried risk. A misstep could trigger a collapse, an ambush, or exposure to hazardous substances. Yet Arthur relied on his instincts, honed by years of life on the frontier. He learned to read subtle cues, the faint hum of energy indicating an unstable machine, the way a shadow shifted, suggesting an enemy, the telltale smell of chemicals, warning of toxic hazards. In the West, survival meant reading people and animals. Here, it meant reading the land itself, attuning to every unnatural vibration. Arthur also faced environmental challenges that tested his endurance to the limit. Heat radiated from smoldering debris, burning his skin through his coat, while pockets of toxic gas drifted unpredictably through narrow corridors. Water was scarce and often tainted, forcing him to ration every drop and rely on intuition to locate safe sources.
He found that improvisation, a skill essential in the West, became even more critical here. Pieces of broken machinery served as tools, metal scraps became barricades, and the environment itself often offered solutions to seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Every victory, no matter how small, reinforced his sense of resilience and adaptability. The hostile environment was not limited to terrain alone. He encountered storms of ash and energy that seemed almost alive, tearing through the streets with unpredictable force. Gusts of wind ripped debris into the air, forcing him to dive for cover, while arcs of lightning danced across the sky, striking dangerously close. Arthur felt the raw power of the Imperium's world pressing against him, testing his limits, and he realized that fear, carefully managed, could sharpen his senses instead of paralyzing him. He moved with calculated caution, timing his movements between gusts and flashes, relying on intuition and experience to survive. Despite the constant dangers, Arthur found a rhythm in the chaos. His movements became fluid, anticipatory. He learned to read the environment almost instinctively. A partially collapsed bridge, once terrifying, became a tactical advantage. A scorched alleyway offered cover from distant threats. A cracked building provided a vantage point to observe patrols or avoid hazards. He adapted to the rhythm of destruction, turning what could have been obstacles into tools for survival. Every step reinforced his understanding that mastery over environment was as crucial as mastery over any weapon. By the time night, or what passed for night under the sickly green skies, fell, Arthur's body was bruised and battered, his clothes torn and dirty, yet he felt a strange exhilaration. He had survived another day in a world that seemed determined to consume him, learning its rhythms, anticipating its dangers, and mastering its hostile terrain one careful step at a time. Every environmental hazard, every unstable surface, every pulse of energy became part of the intricate puzzle he had to solve to stay alive. And he felt the familiar stubborn spark that had kept him alive all his life, an unyielding will to endure, adapt, and press forward no matter the cost.
Arthur Morgan had survived countless dangers on the frontier, from ruthless lawmen to rival gangs, from violent storms to the unforgiving wilderness. But forming alliances in the Imperium was a challenge unlike any he had ever faced. In the West, trust was earned slowly, often through shared danger or loyalty to a gang. Yet here, amidst the towering spires, scorched streets, and oppressive machinery, every individual seemed burdened with suspicion, fear, or hidden agendas. Arthur had learned quickly that brute force or intimidation alone would not secure allies. He needed patience, observation, and a subtle understanding of human and sometimes non-human behavior. It began with a small group he encountered in a partially collapsed plaza, huddled together behind fragments of ruined walls. They were a mix of civilians and lightly armed militia, their eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Arthur noticed immediately that they were wary of one another, tense and defensive, their interactions laced with suspicion. Each glance, each movement was calculated, as if they were constantly evaluating threats not only from the environment, but from each other. I recognized that look, the look of people who had been betrayed too often, who had been forced to survive alone for too long. It was familiar, and I understood instinctively that if he hoped to earn their trust, he would have to demonstrate more than skill. He would have to prove loyalty, competence, and reliability under pressure. Arthur approached carefully, hands visible, revolver holstered, but ready. His voice was steady, calm, carrying the authority that had served him well back home. "Ain't looking for trouble," he said, letting the words carry weight without aggression. "But you're outnumbered out here, and I reckon I can help." He noticed the flicker of skepticism in their eyes, and he didn't blame them. Survival in this world had taught them that promises often meant death. Arthur knew that words alone were useless. He would have to act. Their first test came almost immediately. A patrol of armored enforcers swept through the ruined streets, scanning for unauthorized movement. The group froze, fear etched into every line of their faces. Arthur acted quickly, signaling them to stay low and leading them through a series of crumbling alleys and debris-laden corridors, using shadows and cover to avoid detection. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the same sensation that had carried him through countless shootouts and heists in the West, but heightened, amplified by the alien dangers around him. When the patrol passed, the group looked at him with a mixture of relief and wary respect. It wasn't trust yet, but it was a start. Over the following days, Arthur worked to solidify the fragile alliances. He shared his knowledge of tactics and survival, teaching the group how to read the environment, anticipate patrols, and improvise with the limited resources available. He helped them scavenge for supplies, find safe routes through hazardous zones, and repair damaged equipment. With each successful maneuver, the tension in the group eased slightly, replaced by a grudging respect. Arthur realized that leadership here was as much about guidance and protection as it was about demonstrating strength. In a world dominated by fear and power, showing competence and care could inspire loyalty as effectively as gunfire. One evening, while they rested in a partially fortified building, Arthur observed the dynamics within the group. Arguments flared over scarce resources, tempers frayed under stress, and old grievances surfaced. He remembered Dutch and the lessons of leadership in a gang, the balance of authority, diplomacy, and toughness. Arthur intervened subtly, mediating disputes, offering solutions, and occasionally letting minor conflicts resolve themselves to maintain cohesion. His presence became a stabilizing force, and he noticed that people began to defer to him, not out of fear, but out of recognition that his guidance increased their chances of survival. Trust deepened when they faced a direct threat. A chaos-corrupted creature emerged from the shadows, grotesque and deadly, its unnatural form twisting reality itself. The group panicked, but Arthur acted decisively, positioning them strategically, assigning cover, and coordinating movements to maximize their effectiveness. He took the lead in the engagement, using both his revolver and the environment to outmaneuver the creature. The group followed, hesitant at first, but gradually moving with confidence under his direction. When the threat was neutralized, the survivors looked at him with genuine gratitude. Their fear mingled with respect. Bonds had begun to form, forged in shared danger and mutual reliance. Arthur also recognized the importance of listening. He learned the names, histories, and skills of each member, understanding their fears, motivations, and strengths. He adapted his approach to each individual, offering encouragement to the hesitant, guidance to the inexperienced, and camaraderie to those who had been hardened by loss. In a universe dominated by alien authority and unrelenting violence, these personal connections became as vital as any weapon. He realized that survival depended not just on skill or courage, but on the ability to inspire, support, and protect those around him. Over time, the group began to function as a cohesive unit, each member contributing according to their abilities, trusting Arthur's judgment and offering support in return. Arthur found himself navigating not only the dangers of the environment, but the complexities of leadership, understanding the delicate balance between authority, respect, and camaraderie. In this grim, war-torn universe, human connection became a weapon in its own right, a way to coordinate, survive, and maintain a sense of humanity amidst chaos. Through these alliances, Arthur began to see the value of strategy over brute force, of planning over recklessness, and of trust earned through action rather than words. He had survived countless gunfights and storms in the West, but here in the Imperium, survival meant forging bonds, guiding others,
and navigating both external threats and internal tensions. He realized that even in a world defined by war, machinery, and corruption, human connection, loyalty, and strategic collaboration could create strength where none seemed possible, and that together they stood a chance of enduring what alone would have surely destroyed them.
Arthur Morgan had fought through countless dangers, survived ambushes, storms, and hostile landscapes, but nothing prepared him for the culmination of all the threats he had faced in the Imperium. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning metal. The ground trembled beneath the march of massive armored forces, and the sky glowed green with unnatural lightning. Chaos forces had emerged en masse from the ruins, grotesque abominations that defied anatomy and reason, their eyes burning with malevolence, while the Imperium soldiers formed rigid lines, their disciplined formations a stark contrast to the chaotic onslaught. Arthur took a deep breath, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline, tempered by the knowledge that instinct alone would not carry him through this battle. He crouched behind a crumbling wall, scanning the battlefield with sharp, practiced eyes. The survivors he had allied with moved alongside him, a mixture of civilians, militia, and fellow wanderers, each holding improvised weapons or scavenged gear, their faces pale but resolute. Arthur felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had become more than just a survivor. He was a leader, a guide, and a shield for those who could not defend themselves. Every decision he made now could mean life or death for the group. He tightened his grip on his revolver, feeling the familiar weight grounding him, even as the sheer scale of the battle threatened to overwhelm. The first wave of chaos erupted from the shattered skyline, twisted forms that slithered, jumped, and charged with unnatural speed. Arthur's heart pounded, but he forced himself to focus, relying on every lesson learned from the West and the Imperium alike. He signaled to the group, directing them toward cover, assigning positions where their limited weapons could be most effective. He ducked and rolled as one of the creatures lunged toward him, firing with precision, the rounds finding gaps in the abomination's flesh. Sparks and blood sprayed across the ground, and Arthur's stomach clenched, but he knew that hesitation would be fatal. The creatures were relentless, and only coordinated action could hold them at bay. As the battle raged, Arthur moved fluidly between positions, his instincts guiding him as much as his planning. He drew on his knowledge of cover and movement, learned from years of surviving ambushes and gunfights, adapting it to this unfamiliar and lethal environment. He directed the survivors to flank weaker enemies, to use debris and machinery as improvised barricades, and to coordinate their attacks with the Imperium soldiers' volleys. Every decision required split-second judgment. Every action demanded courage and precision. The chaos of the battlefield was almost intoxicating, but Arthur's mind remained razor-sharp, aware that one mistake could be catastrophic. The Imperium forces, disciplined and unyielding, formed lines of fire, their laser guns and bolters creating a wall of searing light and thunderous impacts. Arthur used their firepower to his advantage, luring chaos creatures into crossfires, timing his movements to coincide with volleys that would maximize damage. Yet even with their support, the enemy was overwhelming, each abomination more grotesque and deadly than the last. Arthur felt a deep, familiar thrill, the mixture of fear, adrenaline, and exhilaration that came from facing impossible odds, and he knew he had to harness it rather than succumb to it. At one point, a massive creature, larger than anything he had encountered, crashed into the line, its movements tearing through soldiers and rubble alike. Arthur's breath caught, but he didn't hesitate.
He signaled to the survivors to target the joints, the weak points, improvising a strategy that relied on both precision and timing. He moved close enough to draw the creature's attention, dodging its strikes, firing at critical spots, and using the environment to channel it toward traps and concentrated fire. The battle became a dance, a tense coordination of human instinct, improvisation, and the disciplined power of the Imperium's forces. Arthur's mind raced, calculating angles, anticipating movements, and adapting constantly to the unpredictable enemy. Amid the chaos, Arthur noticed the survivors struggling to maintain cohesion. Panic threatened to fracture their ranks, and he moved among them, shouting guidance, offering encouragement, and taking point in dangerous maneuvers. His presence became an anchor, a source of focus and confidence that allowed them to continue fighting even as the world around them seemed hell-bent on destruction. He drew on his years of experience leading men in the West, translating those lessons into this alien and brutal environment. Leadership here was not just about strategy. It was about presence, reassurance, and decisive action in moments of unimaginable terror. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though the sky above and the tremors beneath made time meaningless. Arthur found himself in close combat with several chaos abominations, relying on a combination of firearms, environmental hazards, and sheer cunning to survive. His revolver cracked against armored flesh, makeshift explosives detonated with precision, and he used rubble and debris as improvised weapons. Sweat stung his eyes, muscles ached, and every sense screamed for relief. Yet he pressed on. The stakes were higher than anything he had faced in the West. These creatures were not just dangerous, they were unrelenting, alien, and terrifying. Amid the fighting, Arthur caught sight of the tech priest and some of the Imperium soldiers coordinating energy weapons and machinery to channel destructive force against the largest threats. Arthur seized the opportunity, directing the survivors to support these efforts, to position themselves where their actions could amplify the Imperium's strikes. Each creature brought down was a small victory, but every victory revealed the scale of the challenge yet to come. He adapted constantly, combining his intuition, quick thinking, and understanding of both human and mechanical allies to survive. Through the relentless chaos, Arthur felt a strange exhilaration, a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and determination that sharpened every reflex and honed every decision. He realized that survival in the Imperium, especially in a climactic battle like this, required more than courage. It required a synthesis of everything he had learned: human instincts, adaptability, leadership, tactical thinking, and the unyielding will to endure. Every shot fired, every maneuver executed, and every life protected reinforced his belief in his own capacity to navigate impossible odds. Arthur Morgan moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, part instinct, part strategy, a man tempered by decades of survival, yet facing horrors beyond imagination. The sky above glowed ominously, the ground shook with the march of legions, and the screams of creatures and men alike echoed across the ruined city. He pressed forward, revolver firing, guiding the survivors and weaving through the chaos, each step a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and the unyielding will to survive against overwhelming odds.